Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and it's my great privilege to serve as director of Roosevelt House. And tonight, on behalf of Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb, I want to welcome you to yet another Roosevelt House virtual program. And I'm happy to report that we've now calculated that 15,000 guests have been tuning in to Roosevelt House virtual programming since the lockdown began a year ago. We wish it didn't have to be so, but we're awfully proud that so many of you have been tuning in. Before we begin, I also want to send a happy St. Patrick's Day greetings to our audience. At Hunter, we feel a strong connection to Irish heritage through Hunter College founder Thomas Hunter, an immigrant from Ireland who came to New York and founded a school that expressed a progressive vision of inclusivity, education, and opportunity for all. So even though New Yorkers are limited in what they can do to celebrate this year, we have Thomas Hunter to inspire us on this St. Patrick's Day. And there's also another major connection. Today is Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt's 106th wedding anniversary. They were married just about 9 blocks from Roosevelt House on East 76th Street on St. Patrick's Day, 1905. Why St. Patrick's Day? Because it was the only day that President Theodore Roosevelt agreed to be in New York to give away the bride, Eleanor, his niece. An inveterate multitasker, Teddy decided that he would come directly from the St. Patrick's Day parade to the townhouse on 76 so that he could accomplish two goals in one single holiday. 5 decades later, in her enormously successful newspaper column, My Day, Eleanor recalled her wedding day and its association with St. Patrick's Day with her usual reserve and directness and in an unusual combination. She said the day always had special meaning to her because of the memory of her wedding. That's about as far as she went. We can read what we want into that, but let's just say that we all are happy to mark the the anniversary. And of course, the townhouse in which they were married was a mother-son double townhouse. And attending the wedding there, FDR's mother, Sarah, no doubt got the idea that she liked this arrangement. She proceeded within 6 months to buy land and design a sketch of a townhouse for herself and for her new daughter-in-law and her son. One final note is that we're also marking Women's History Month throughout March. And so we're pleased to be coalescing all of these uh, events and all of these celebrations into one important and, as I said, unique event this evening, in which we're pleased to welcome to our virtual stage the award-winning poet, Gray Jacobic. Nationally recognized as a writer of great depth and distinction, she's the author of 6 books, including an acclaimed one called The Banquet, which collects new and selected poems from throughout her decades-long career. And it has been a most productive one. Her work has appeared in the Kenyon Review, the Georgia Review, Plowshares, all the major poetry magazines and journals, and more than once in the annual anthology series, Best American Poetry. She's won the Yates Prize, the Emily Dickinson Prize. What more can we say? She's a most honored and distinguished poet, and we're quite honored to have her, particularly because she's joining us to read from and discuss her newest book entitled simply Eleanor. And of course, it's about Eleanor Roosevelt. In this innovative work, Gray combines the power of imagination with a well of deep research into Eleanor's life and thoughts, achieving an effect that is equal parts history and poetry. The poems put readers in the rooms where it happened, in some cases in the rooms of Roosevelt House, as Eleanor ponders the fraught familial and political realities of her complicated life. Sensitively rendered as well as unflinching, Jacobic's poems offer a window into the thoughts and emotions of a woman who, in life circumstances, preferred to keep personal tumult from public view. With some of the 20th century's most important national and international events unfolding in the background of these poems, Jacobic explores such topics as the Roosevelt children, Eleanor's closest and most passionate friendships, and her path to becoming a global icon of human rights. Focus falls also, of course, on her relationship with her husband, in particular, her commitment to caring for him at Roosevelt House after polio caused paralysis of his legs, at the same time as she struggled to reconcile his sudden helplessness with his recent marital infidelity. A complicated story, and we can't wait to hear it explored in the medium of poetry. To chat with Gray Jacobic this evening, we are particularly delighted to welcome back the preeminent Eleanor Roosevelt biographer and a proud Hunter graduate from the class of 1962, someone who actually met Eleanor Roosevelt, one of our great favorites at Roosevelt House, Blanche Wiesen Cook. Blanche is a distinguished professor of history and women's studies at John Jay College and the CUNY Graduate Center. And of course, she's the author, as any of us who have joined us for the many programs Blanche has appeared in, the author of the definitive and celebrated 3-volume biography of Eleanor, which encompass the early years, the defining years, and the recently published 3rd volume, The War Years and After, a magnificent trilogy. And we're very pleased always to welcome our friend Blanche back to Roosevelt House, albeit virtually. So with that, please welcome 2 brilliant women who have channeled another brilliant woman, Eleanor Roosevelt, in their careers. Please welcome Blanche Wiesen Cook and Gray Jacobic. Blanche, over to you.
Thank you, Harold. It's always a pleasure to be with you and always a thrill to be at Roosevelt House, even though we are not, as a matter of fact, right inside Roosevelt House, which over the years has been such a joyous place for so many of us. It's where Audre Lorde got married. It's where Claire and I celebrated so many parties in our anniversary. And Gray, I am so delighted to meet you. Welcome to Roosevelt House. I love your book. I'm dazzled by how you were able to capture Eleanor Roosevelt's voice in poetry, but it's her voice. I must ask you, how did you manage to do that, and what got you started with Eleanor Roosevelt?
Wow. Well, it was a confluence of a couple of things. One of them was for many years, I taught poetry as literature, and I always, about every year, I taught When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed by Whitman, the famous long poem about Lincoln's assassination and death. And at some point I asked myself, why isn't there a lilacs for FDR, a president as loved and as loathed as Lincoln was? And so I think that was operating in the back of my mind. I wanted to write a poem about Roosevelt's death. And I realized, considering that I needed a dramatic narrator. And so since Eleanor was witness, I thought, all right, it's got to be Eleanor. But at the same time, I had been listening on books on tape to Doris Kearns Godwin's No Ordinary Time. And that's about the war years. And she's written it chapter by chapter, one about FDR, one about ER. And it goes back and forth through the war years like that. And I noticed I was absolutely riveted whenever the chapter was about Eleanor, and much less so when it was about Franklin. So I began asking myself, well, why is that? Why does she call to me so strongly? And so that's when I found your first volume and immersed myself in that. And then the second volume, I had to wait with the rest of the world for years for that third volume. But in fact, I mean, I think in part it took me 17 years to write this book because I was waiting for your third volume. But I also read all of the many of the books that Eleanor wrote, her 4 autobiographies with all the caveats that you told me about. And, but also her columns, her essays, as much as I could. And I found that her letters especially gave me access to her voice. Her letters seemed closest to her voice. And that's where I think I absorbed it.
Great.
Let me begin with one of the poems. This is a poem that is about the Roosevelt House. It's poem number,
Holding up your book.
and it's dated 1907.
It's poem number what?
13. The poems are just numbered, not titled.
Right.
A few years after Franklin and I married, my mother-in-law hired Charles A. Platt to design Siamese twin brownstones on 65th Street. We had a common entryway, her door to the left, ours to the right. Mama insisted on pocket doors. Doors opened onto 4 of our house's 5 floors. Thus she would appear, a white revenant in her sleeping robe at night, or any hour of the day. Corseted and brusquely intrusive, I never felt free. One evening I began sobbing and couldn't stop. "You've gone quite mad, Eleanor," Franklin fumed. I simply couldn't abide living one more instant in a home I had not chosen. Why hadn't you raised the matter sooner? For God's sake, for pity's sake. But I was dutiful. Duty was all I knew. I complied, I acquiesced, I adjusted. I seldom raised objections. But then I brooded, schemed, undertook subterfuge, worked behind the scenes, became a covert manipulator of emotions, qualities in me that, over the years, served Franklin, the politician, even as they infuriated the man.
That is so powerful, Gray. I mean, it gets the tense and unhappy relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and the woman who really always criticized her to the very end. And Eleanor was loyal, and, you know, it's an amazing poem, and you've gotten it so perfectly. And how all of her skills served FDR, the politician, even though he was critical of it personally. I love what you did there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And her ability to create all of these personas. You have a poem about her years at Allenswood School, where she thanks in life Marie Souvestre, that extraordinary headmistress. And by the way, there is no biography to this day of Marie Souvestre, which I tell my graduate students on a regular basis. But I love your work on that, and I wonder if you would bless us with
transition to these very, very formative years. She's really an adolescent, and this is what saved her and defined her. So this poem, which is number 12, and for the sake of time, I'm going to skip some sections, but this takes place in 1899. So it's the fin de siècle. And it's, she has managed with some difficulty to get herself to Wimbledon, to England, for this course of study, which ends her formal education, which is a profound sadness to her all of her life. But it was a great, great way to end it if you had to end your formal education here. 1899. Here is Mademoiselle Sylvestre, her brilliant talk darting like sunfish through a dappled summer pond. No subject dull or irrelevant once her magnificent intensity bore down upon it. The daughter of an esteemed French philosopher and novelist, her mind and creativity encouraged since infancy. A radical thinker, a central figure among intellectuals, the epitome of a sophisticated European. An independent, liberal-minded woman, now the center of my youthful worship. I was 15 when I first came to her, she 68. We took history classes in Mademoiselle Sylvestre's library, a charming room lined with books and filled with flowers and art on the walls, including nudes, which we were afraid to stare at, lest another see our curiosity. The windows looked out on a large expanse of lawn and shade trees that became perches and crannies for rooks in winter. Mademoiselle stood before a large map and lectured on the wars and the political alliances that shaped the beginning and end of nations, the heroes and moral issues, the art and literature of each era. She spoke of the French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, the Franco-Prussian War, and the current day Boer War the English were fighting. She was opposed to colonial domination of smaller countries, not a safe view to hold in Wimbledon at the time. I felt led into a cave full of the gold and jewels of empires and given the vision to see they were worthless unless a nobler, more decent future came into existence. Wonder, fury, and sorrow flooded me. I felt the shifting warp and weft of all human striving and my own small existence weaving itself into history's imposing tapestry. During holidays, at only 17, I became Madame Sylvestre's traveling companion. We grew quite close, journeying to Paris, then Marseille, down the Mediterranean coast to Pisa, Florence, Rome. In Florence, she came upon me once. My Baedeker opened at a description of the Campanile. My dear, she said, the only way to know a city is to walk its streets. Alone, I wandered that city with its rich flavor of antiquity. Reading Dante laboriously, I had plenty of imagination to draw upon. Every scene, every face became a part of the eternal pageant. Even though I became quite lost in the narrow streets, those hours were glorious. I wandered toward whatever called to me from curiosity or beauty, and I came to love the world and feeling alive and free. Many of Mademoiselle's fascinating and impressive friends, both men and women, appeared at dinner, which at Allenswood was always formal. Since I was a favorite, some say her favorite of favorites, I often sat at table directly across from Mademoiselle, where I learned a great deal eavesdropping on her exchanges with artists, philosophers, political leaders, novelists, poets. I picked up the habit of asking leading questions, then using a few scraps of facts and the few words I heard in an answer would appear to know more than I knew. when I was First Lady and later a delegate to the United Nations, then ambassador at large, this habit served me well. Although I lived in dread of others discovering that, often I understood an issue only superficially. This is cleverness, and oh yes, I can at times be quite clever. Mademoiselle, you see, still admonishes me from heaven. Toddy, what a miscreant you are. What an example. Now that's in French, but I had to say it in English because my French is awful. But that's
This,
Mademoiselle.
yeah, this is such a brilliant poem, and you, if I can be a little obnoxious, because I love every word of it, and you left out a couple of paragraphs. Do you call them stanzas?
Yes, stanzas, yes.
Stanzas. The power of words by her desire that each of us live a bold and and impassioned life. I thought to reach out and pluck what she strove to give, although at times my will was completely subverted. I took the fruit that she proffered so lovingly. She, and she alone, is the source of any good I have ever done anyone, or my country, or the larger world. And I just think, you know, that everything she wrote that in so many different ways, so many times,
That's right.
that,
Yeah.
I mean, here she was for 3 years, saved by this brilliant woman who tore up the papers of students who merely repeated what she said because she wanted every one of her students to think for themselves, be creative, be bold. And that was her message: be bold, be creative, unpack your heart. And we all learn from Eleanor Roosevelt what she learned from Marie Souvestre,
Absolutely.
and thank you. Thank you, Ray. You just captured it.
Thank you. Yes, and
And-
she comes back to her at different times of her life, and whenever she needs to strengthen herself and to make courageous decisions, she remembers Marie Sylvestre and has her photograph with her all the time at her bedside.
Right. Yeah, really great. Well, you capture so many people in this splendid book of poetry, which everybody should go out and get as soon as possible. For me, what you wrote about Earl Miller is so extraordinary. And there's a situation, he and Earl Miller had a correspondence. People refer to it. Joe Lash had seen it. And then all of a sudden, and she wrote to him for decades, and all of the letters have disappeared. They've been destroyed or hidden.
Right.
And I have some wonderful pictures of, Earl Miller. I don't know if you can, I created a new category to understand what happened between them, as in, look at that hunk, why not? That's my, but you, in her voice, give us more detail.
Yes.
Over to you, Gray.
Yes. Well, this was the advantage that a poet has. I have this poetic license, right? That
Right.
historian can give us what we know and suggest.
Right. I never make anything up if I don't have the, but I
Yeah.
like how you made it up. Here, he got her the horse that she rode. I have a picture of her shooting. They went shooting together.
Yes.
And then you give us more detail.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to read a sequence of these poems, and it starts with poem number 23, which is on page 63 if you're following in the book. This is 1929. FDR is governor of New York. ER is 45 years old at this point. And because FDR can't walk, she performs some of the state inspections on his behalf, but also this keeps her name in the press, which was very important. And that was something Louis Howe wanted her to do, to keep the Roosevelt name in the press. So she goes out on these inspection tours. And 1929. If I was going to inspect institutions and public works, I wanted to drive my own car. I refused to be chauffeured about in a limousine. So Franklin assigned Corporal Miller, a state trooper, to guard and escort me. Hour after hour, a day or two a week, as we drove around a lake or through a valley, quite naturally we drew into conversation. I sensed, as perhaps only another orphan would, the depths and hollows of Earl's shielded loneliness. Kin of the same heart, although not of the same social class, I offered him the solace of my friendship. He offered me the solace of his. We covered quite a bit of territory. And after I told him of Franklin and Lucy Mercer, we grew closer. We spoke until we emptied ourselves of our histories, and then we simply looked at eyes, lips, hands, the way a body carries itself as it moves across the room. I was at war with myself for the vision of Earl's body that would leave me awash at a window or frozen at the threshold of a door. I was unable to sit still in my bath or to lie still in my bed or to be in any one place for more than a minute or two without feeling my legs about to carry me off, fire burning slowly across the plains and hills of my skin. Not only had I absorbed every scintilla of Grandmother Hall's prudery, but for 11 years I clung to my indignation, my self-righteousness over Franklin's infidelity, and now I was about to commit adultery with a man a dozen years younger than I was, a man not of my class, nor of my station, my children's mother, Sarah Roosevelt's daughter-in-law, a Ludlow Livingston Hall Roosevelt, the first lady of the Empire State, a Roosevelt twice over. Earl touched my body with such reverence. "Oh, my lady," he'd say, "my dear, dear lady." And my pulse raced with the joy of it. I think too, driving on those rough roads stimulated my body so as to render me especially sensitive to touch. When I did succumb, after having passed through the lobby of an out-of-the-way hotel, my face hidden beneath a broad-brimmed hat, all the repression and weariness, the long stuffed down and sat upon, welled up and burst. I gave Earl the charge blaster, but I let myself explode.
Thank you, Gray. That is very, very powerful. Frankly, hot.
Well,
Wonderful. Wonderful.
thanks. Yeah, it's certainly another one of those relationships that empowered her. You know,
It
he
did.
lived to serve her, and
She actually says in another poem, number 27,
yes, yeah,
that how much it meant to her, how much she transcended the barriers
mhm.
by this relationship. Maybe if you could, would you like to read just part of that?
Sure, yeah.
Extraordinary.
Yeah,
I let it, yeah.
And Madame Sylvester comes back into this again too.
I let his words show me who he saw me to be.
Yes, right.
And I,
Okay, let me read that. And I will go into the next one too, because this, you talked about her being a serial romantic, and this is, and number 28 is also where the romanticism that she credits with coming from Walter Scott. That whole generation read these books of Walter Scott and created a kind of romantic
Yes.
mythos that held her. So let me read those two. Earl's love forced me to overcome the barrier of age and the barrier of class. And then, reflected in his brown eyes, I felt at last I was something of a beauty. When he touched me or gently urged my body in this direction or that, I felt strong and sleek as an otter. He drew the compass of my senses. Once in one of the dozens of seaside villages we escaped to for a weekend, to late diners on an outdoor patio, to anonymous everyday lovers. With tears in his eyes, whispering in his deep voice, the words coming slowly, he said, "You are a great woman, dear lady, whose destiny I was born to serve with every ounce of my strength." I let his words show me who he saw me to be. And I thought of Mademoiselle Sylvestre all those evenings long ago in England, when we schoolgirls sat about her in her parlor and she read to us. How radiant she was, and how I longed for her to look up and smile at me. The deep confidence she bred in me returned through the extraordinary men and women I came to know and admire. My closest women friends, and Earl, Louis Howe, and Lorena, of course, for I could not admire myself and perhaps truly love myself until I saw how they saw me and felt how they loved me.
That is so great. That is so great. And each of them, of course, gave her so much to do. I mean, it was Hick who said, you write me all of these beautiful letters every day. The whole world wants to know what you think.
Exactly.
And it was Hick, the journalist, who said, why don't you start a column? And that became My Day, which she wrote from 1936 to the end of her life in 1962. And it was the people who loved her, who enriched her and enabled her to do all that she did. And you capture that just with each poem.
Thank you
With-
so much. Thank you. Thanks.
And then you're going to read 28 or?
Yeah, there was one little other part here. Yes, right, 28. Oh, and just the tail end of 26, then I'll move to 28. Just because it sort of completes the arc of the history with some of Earl. Over the years after Ruth, Earl divorced and married 2 more times. And most regrettably, after Franklin's death, when I was, in a sense, the nation's widow, his 3rd wife, seeking her divorce, named me a co-conspirator to Earl's infidelity. One occasion, I was grateful I carried the Roosevelt name, and that by then I could direct my income through discreet channels. His wife was given custody of their 2 children, a girl named Eleanor and a boy named Earl. And I've always hoped she set aside that settlement for their education.
Thank you.
Earl and I were lady and knight errant, a reality that transcended time and form. We had simply to accede to this truth as evidenced in our hearts. I know there is an element of the romantic and even the fantastical in this view, but nothing has ever enabled me as knowing this has. The world of appearances is handled easily when the world of substance, the soul's realm, is before you. I discovered this as a lonely child when I would climb a tree at Tivoli to read the stories of Walter Scott. And I agree, in the way of literature, Scott's stories shaped me, and they shaped Earl. The outward scene became chaotic over time. I cannot count the women, often dancers or actresses and heavy drinkers, a few rather uncouth. Earl brought to Valkill, not to mention his 3 wives. He accepted my peculiarities and the demands of my position, and we never stopped enjoying one another's company. What mattered most was he needed me, and I needed his loyalty.
Great. And in this poem, you bring up her problems with people who were alcoholic. She
Yeah.
was surrounded by alcoholics. And of course, her father, she was an orphan at 10. Her mother died when she was 8, and her father died when she was 10, having drunk himself to death at the age of 34.
Right.
And that legacy of alcoholism, how much do you have to drink to die at 34? I mean, we're still here. You know, it's really a stunning reality that she carried with her throughout her life, and you capture that also. There is only you had wanted to read maybe the St. Louis or human rights, and then I don't remember what you said earlier, but you wanted to read a couple of poems that took place
After
FDR's death.
yeah, yeah, there's so much.
There is.
The
I just want to say there's only one line in this entire book that I don't agree with. At one point, you say that she loved somebody. I love him more than I have ever loved any other. You write that about David Gurevich. And that just, for me, I think of Eleanor Roosevelt as a serial romantic. You know, she fell in love with lots of people,
yes,
including, I have this picture of Eleanor Roosevelt and Bernard Baruch, who was her companion for a while. You know, she falls in love and then out of love. She's very loyal to their friendship reality, but it's, in my opinion, just not true that she loved David more than anybody else. I mean, he's just one of many in her life.
yes,
My
right.
opinion, as a serial romantic.
Yeah, and he was her late life, or later life.
Yes, right.
Okay.
I just wanted to bring up the others.
Okay, so I want to keep my eye on the time here. So I'd like to read a little bit about after she leaves the White House and this, you know, astonishingly important career that she has. Number 51 is set in 1946. The fate of war refugees was an issue I cared deeply about. Not only the pitiable Jewish survivors of the death camps, but other displaced persons as well. Lithuanians, Estonians, Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Latvians, the Yugoslav, and of course, the Soviet position was that any refugee who refused to return was either a quisling, a collaborator, or a traitor. They proposed forcing refugees to return to their country of origin and accept whatever punishment was meted out. Most were living in flimsy, frigid, unsanitary camps. I felt strongly, and most in the West agreed. They were simply suffering people who either fled Germany in fear for their lives or who survived occupation or internment against all odds. They ought to be free to live wherever they felt their families might thrive, in any country that granted them entry. Since VE Day, hundreds of thousands of children have been born. Would the Soviets have each nation raise the children in state-run orphanages, robbing the parents of their lone remaining solace? And in the case of German Jews, how could we return them to a nation the world had condemned for its rapacious anti-Semitism? Delegates spent endless hours attempting to frame a resolution all might sign. The Soviets challenged each attempt. Vinshinsky, one of Russia's great legal minds, a man expert in wielding wit and ridicule, spoke twice. I was the only woman member of our delegation to the United Nations. The men huddled behind my back, sent Dulles to ask, and he did so quite lamely, Mrs. Roosevelt, the United States must speak in this debate. Do you think you could say a few words? Say a few words? You'd think he wanted me to address the Garden Club's June luncheon. I debated the famous Mr. Vinshinsky. I did my best. The hour was late. The Russians delayed the vote in hope some of our allies would tire and leave. I knew I must hold the South Americans, so I spoke of Simón Bolívar, who had fought for freedom from Spanish colonial control, whose fighters had secured independence for a good part of Hispanic America. I became, at that moment, speaking before the General Assembly, Mademoiselle Silvestre. I saw her rolling down the map of the world that hung in her library, heard her speak again of the injustice of colonial rule, and I saw as well images of the gaunt and starved survivors in their striped rags who greeted our allies when they liberated the German camps. The South American representatives stayed and voted with us. We won. Of course, the United Nations would concern itself with the fate of these refugees for many years. But the principle of the right of individuals to choose where they wish to live was secured. My voice trembled, my legs shook, my hands clutched the podium. I do not know where I find the strength at such times, only that it is not my doing. I wished Franklin had heard me, and Madame Silvestre, and of course, my father. Mine was an old woman's victory, one to savor deeply, quietly, but it was a victory.
Ray, that is such an important poem. And here we are in the 21st century,
I know.
where it is the United States separating families at the border.
Absolutely.
4,000 children separated from their families, still not united.
I
And
know.
we've got to rethink it and rethink Eleanor Roosevelt's vision and Eleanor Roosevelt's courage, and the courage that enables us all to write clearly and speak boldly. And I am so grateful for your words and your work. And perhaps we have 3 more minutes for another poem, and then we'll open for Q&A.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
welcome. I want to start with a little bit with the poem that started this all for me when just after Franklin dies. This is poem 49, and it's April 1945. You remember he died in what was called the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. slowly along the 800 miles of track from Warm Springs to Washington. We carried Franklin's body home. I, alone in a Pullman, exhausted, yet keyed up, thinking of all I had to do in the next days. And there, through a day and night and into the next, at every small crossroads or town, along the streets of cities or in clusters at the edge of fields, people waited beside the track to pay tribute to Franklin. Men took off hats, held them to their chests, bowed their heads. Boys stood with arms around the shoulders of sweetheart or sister, the women weeping, the men weeping. Once I glimpsed 4 Negroes in a cotton field fall to their knees in prayer. Rock of Ages or Abide with Me floated through the windows. Church choirs waiting trackside, their voices swelling when they saw my face. Their children wrapped in blankets, parents held them high, so one day they might remember the train that carried Roosevelt home. I wept at such a tide of sorrow. At nightfall, we darkened the cars, lit only the last, the president's, so his catafalque draped in our flag could be seen for miles. I moved outside of myself then and entered the pageant of the public mourner, caught up in this tempest of grief, lost, bleak, vague in myself. I felt surprised nonetheless by this great outpouring. I knew the man and his weaknesses and shortcomings, his failings as a father, husband, friend. He had betrayed me yet again, so I learned within minutes of arriving at Warm Springs, for his cousin, Laura Delano, told me Lucy Mercer Rutherford was with him when his cerebral hemorrhage struck. She had dined at the White House several times that year, their meetings arranged and covered by our daughter. Franklin had promised me, on condition I not divorce him, he would never see her again. That last spring, with Franklin's circle of intimates shrunken, this loneliest of men reached out to me once more from companionship, and I declined his request. My awful failing is not forgetting a hurt, rarely forgiving one. So I think I should stop there.
It is such a powerful poem, Gray, and it goes through the entire journey of their relationship and of the political and visionary aspects of their partnership and of their broken hearts.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
Do you want to say a wrap-up word?
Well, it reflects back to the moment of his proposal by the Nashua River at the Groton School in Groton, Massachusetts. And she thinks about what the purpose of that 40-year marriage was that began on St. Patrick's Day and lasted 40 years. And what the legacy was and how she was, how she mourned him, how she respected him, how they respected one another.
And she did to the very end. His vision was her vision was his vision. And of course, she went much further when it came, especially to racial justice.
Yes.
And, and I must say at this moment, when we're thinking about the future, healthcare for all was supposed to be in the 1935 Social Security Act, and the AMA lobbied it to death. But Eleanor Roosevelt campaigned for it with her great friends, Esther Lape, L-A-P-E, and there's no biography of Esther Lape for those of you out there looking for a project. Anyway, Gray, your book is...
Can I say one word about Esther Lape, which is
yes.
that I live just a few miles from Salt Marsh.
Oh, how wonderful. Salt Meadow?
Salt Meadow, and I go there often, and the cabin in which Eleanor wrote one of her autobiographies is there. But I always think when I walk behind the house to the fire pit that is still there, that's where the letters were burned. The, the Earl and Eleanor letters were burned on the night of her death behind that house. So,
Really? By Esther Lake?
yeah.
Really? I didn't know that.
Well, that's my poetic license there. I don't know that. But
I'm
we
not
know,
sure
we know
they
that
were
they
burned by
they
Esther Lake.
burned some of her journals. We know
What?
that
Sorry.
we know that they burned some of her journals that night, right?
Yes,
So
yes, they did.
might have burned the letters too.
Well, we will someday discover what happened to those letters. I think some children might tell us over the years. And it perhaps is time to open for Q&A.
Yes, thank you,
Mac,
guys.
are
Thank
we
you, Gray.
there?
We have some great
Thank you,
questions here
Gray.
from the audience. I'll read a few of those to you now. The first from a name that will sound familiar, Laura Roosevelt. She asks, did Eleanor stay in touch with Marie Souvestre after leaving school?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah,
Although she didn't live much longer.
She didn't, yeah, she didn't live very much longer, but they were in touch until Madame Souvestre died.
I see. Liz Moore asks, why did Eleanor have to end her formal education when she did?
Well, she then had 6 children in 10 years.
Well, no, I mean, her family insisted that she come out at 18 and enter the social world to which she was intended to enter, and they didn't want her to go. She wanted to go to Vassar or Barnet. She was very clear that she'd be happy in the city and go to Barnet, or she'd be happy up there in Hyde Park and go to Vassar, but they did not want her to go to school. She was prevented very specifically by her grandmother and her aunts.
Bertha asks, Gray, what were some of the primary resources that enabled you to come to know this remarkable woman so intimately?
Well, certainly, Professor Cook's 3 volumes are, you know, you can't imagine how I have multiple copies of each, and they're deeply and annotated. But I also read her autobiography, Eleanor's autobiographies, and I read a number of biographies of Adelaide Black's biography. I've already mentioned Doris Kearns Godwin's No Ordinary Time. The Eleanor and Franklin biography that came out some years ago. I'm blanking on the
Joe Lash.
Joe Lash. Yes, absolutely. I read the book that Hickok, Eleanor Roosevelt, Reluctant First Lady.
Reluctant First Lady.
I read that. A World of Love, the letters, as many of the letters as I possibly could read. And I read about Franklin as much as I could too. And I read some of the columns. I read Courage in a Dangerous World. I mean, she wrote 37 books.
She really was a writer. She wrote every day. She wrote articles and columns and books. And she wrote every single day.
And everything from, you know, child raising advice to homemaking advice. And I mean, it was really so interesting to read all the things she did. Leadership, the Eleanor Roosevelt Way.
That's great.
Really like that book, but
That's a lot to work with.
on to
Robin Gerber.
yeah.
We have a follow-up from Laura Roosevelt, who identifies herself as one of Eleanor's grandchildren. She says, do
Hi, Laura.
we know for a fact that Eleanor's romantic relationship with Earl Miller became a sexual one?
No, I created this new category because there are no letters, they've all disappeared. So my new category is why not? But then Gray moved it forward.
I moved it. Yes, no, that's definitely was the riskiest part of writing this was what I imagined around that. Although one of her sons claimed to have thought so. Was it, I can't remember which son, but
Franklin or James.
James, I think, yeah.
Yeah. And then I think one of the sons was responsible for destroying the letters, actually. I don't think Esterlape had anything to do with the burning of them, in my opinion. We don't know. Yeah.
Here's another question from Stephen Gilroy. Is it known whether or not Eleanor Roosevelt herself ever made any attempts at writing poetry?
So,
It's an
I
interesting
don't-
one.
That's an interesting
love
question.
poems.
She loved poetry, and you've won the Yeats Award, and Eleanor Roosevelt read William Butler Yeats, we know that. She read poetry, and she was a fan of poetry, but I have no evidence that she wrote poetry. Have you ever seen? No.
And Stephen has a follow-up. Have any of Eleanor's descendants reacted to any of your poems yet, Gray?
Well, I was invited to mail some of them to Rabbi Bottinger, I believe. And I didn't hear back from him, so I don't think he liked them, but I don't know. No.
I don't know whether this is factually correct. Why are there no photographs of Eleanor, Franklin, and Theodore from their wedding day?
Well, there is her wedding photo, her formal wedding portrait.
That's interesting. Are there none of Theodore?
The questioner, Stephen Gilroy, seems to think so.
Yeah, I thought there was one of him leaving the house and entering the house, leaving the St. Patrick's Day parade and going to her aunt, her cousin's house. Interesting. Maybe they didn't hire a photographer.
Well, Gray, you have your first reaction from a descendant of Eleanor's. Laura Roosevelt says she thinks your poems are wonderful. So there you have a family reaction. And she says she's a poet too.
Great.
Great. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. Another question. Let's see, there are lots of good ones. Eleanor and Jacqueline had similar dominating, critical, snobby mother-in-laws. Did this help them become super achieving first ladies?
The children have to rebel, and if the snobby parents make it easy to rebel, I think that's a plus. What do you think, Gray?
Well, I think Eleanor succeeded despite her, her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Bertha asks, what was Rabbi Bottinger's relationship to Eleanor?
He's a grandson, right? I mean, no,
He's Anna's son.
yeah, yes.
Anna married John Bottinger, and they had 2 children, and the rabbi is her son.
Mhm.
Here's a question from Roosevelt House historian Deborah Gardner, which I'll read verbatim. Why is there no biography of Marie Souvestre, which you referred to early in the talk? Kristen Downey, biographer of Francis Perkins, FDR's Secretary of Labor and the first woman to hold a cabinet position, tracked down Marie Souvestre's letters, which are still with her family in France, but as of 2 years ago had not responded to her request to see them. She speculated that the family was uncomfortable with the fact that Souvestre was a gay woman.
Oh,
That may be. There's Olivia, the novel, indicates that she was a lesbian. Eleanor Roosevelt refers to some of the Eleanor Roosevelt's in that novel. The whole Bloomsbury, the more we know about Bloomsbury, the more we know about Marie Souvestre, larger British connection and her schools prior to Allenswood. So, but I think someday somebody's just going to have to go to France and fight for the correspondence.
Let's see. This is a note of appreciation from a documentary filmmaker who we've hosted at Roosevelt House named Laura Seltzer Dunny. Thank you for this insight on what ER may have felt via poem regarding the refugees. So much we can learn from history and how the US and the UN responds to refugees now.
Yes.
And I think this is just a comment to respond to more so than a question.
Well, Laura is the filmmaker who did Nobody Wanted Us, that wonderful
That's right. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
ship that was returned. No. What's the name of the ship? Anyway, Nobody Wanted Us. Great film. Great film.
Yes, actually, I have a poem about that. Yeah,
What?
You do.
Can you read the poem?
it's the St. Louis, right?
Well,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
that's not the ship that Laura wrote about.
Oh, I see.
She wrote about
yeah.
the ship that landed. And Eleanor Roosevelt said all of the people on the ship could be her guests and that they could stay. So she arranged for her ship that Laura gave us the film about. But it starts because Eleanor Roosevelt said, never again will this happen. And then, of course, the fascist in the State Department protested, and that was the last.
Cordell Hull, right? Yeah.
Let's see. We got. Well, if you'd like to share the poem, in any case.
Okay.
Is it St.
There's
Louis?
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's number 47. And in 1939, when the MS St. Louis filled with 937 German refugees, desperate human beings, sailed toward the port of New York, Franklin refused to allow that ship to enter. Cordell Hull persuaded him that it would be impolitic to admit Semites, the Dixiecrats again. Those poor people, men, women, children, were returned to Europe, and many became casualties of Hitler's systematic extermination. Franklin did not fully realize what fate beheld them. None of us did. Yet great suffering was not alleviated when he alone was entirely capable of offering safe harbor.
Our friend Patricia Kenner has written in to remind us the ship was called Kwanzaa,
Kwanzaa,
a year after the SS St. Louis.
yeah, 1940. Thank you. The Kwanzaa
Yes.
was the 1940 ship. And then the head of the State Department, not Cordell Hull, went to FDR and said, who's in charge here, me or your wife? And FDR said, well, you are. And that was the last effort to let anybody in.
Well, I think we are getting close to our time, but if it's all right with you, I'll just ask one more to finish on.
Okay.
Georgette Clark asks, what advice do you think Eleanor would give us today, given the challenges we are facing?
Well, she would probably give the advice Marie Souvestre gave. Unpack your heart, be bold, be creative, study the situation, and speak out and write up what needs to be done and join a group. We need to build movements, community by community. And that was her great gift to all of us. We can't do it alone. Politics is not an isolated individual adventure. We need movements, and we have movements, and we've got to join them shoulder to shoulder into the future, hearts open, fists high.
Right on.
Okay. Great. Anything to add to that?
I often think of her saying that truly courageous acts are made up of one individual courageous act after another. Just every day do one courageous thing.
Right. And courage is as contagious as fear,
Lovely.
or more contagious than fear. Courage is more contagious than fear.
But this has been absolutely wonderful. If you've got any final thoughts before we wrap up, now would be the time.
It's been a real privilege, Professor Cook.
And it's been a real privilege for me. Thank you. Call me Blanche and I'll call you Gray. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wonderful, wonderful poetry, galvanizing and beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you everyone for attending. With that, good night.